Great. I think we can get started. That's the great thing about Zoom meetings is they usually start on time. So welcome everybody. My name is Christine Schmidt and I'm the Deputy Director and Head of Research at the Wiener Holocaust Library here in London. And on behalf of the library and on behalf of our partners in this event, the Holocaust Research Institute at Royal Holloway, University of London, really pleased to welcome you today. As you know, the Wiener Holocaust Library is one of the oldest institutions that's been collecting and disseminating research about the Holocaust. And we, of course, host a vibrant events and exhibitions program as well. And we're really pleased to be able to get started with this again online in this peculiar situation that we've found ourselves in. But the upside of this is that we're welcoming people from all over the world and participating in our events in ways that we haven't before. So in particular, very happy to see participants from institutions in Israel, in Canada, Australia, the UK, Romania, France, and the United States, including my old stomping grounds at the University of Michigan, Dearborn. There's 2 people waiting in the waiting room. Hold on one sec. And so it's really, really great that you could join us today. Before I introduce our chair and we get started, just remind you of how this works and a bit on some housekeeping. I'll introduce our chair, Simone Gigliotti, in a second, and then we'll be followed by Professor Shneer's presentation. And we'll have time for a Q&A after that. If you could please submit your questions in the chat feature and just keep yourselves on mute throughout the program. This just cuts down on ambient noise. We'll try to answer as many questions and get to as many comments as possible, and I'll be feeding these back to Simone and David. Our session is being recorded, just as a reminder, and we'll be publishing that at a later time. So thank you to everyone for indicating your consent. And also, if you're having any technical issues, just feel free to send me a message. And just remember that all of the chats can be seen by everyone. So if you want to send me a direct message privately, if you're having some technical issues, feel free to do so. So now, without further ado, just to introduce our chair, Dr. Simone Gigliotti, with whom I've had the pleasure of doing a number of events like this, and also with her colleagues at the Holocaust Research Institute. Dr. Gigliotti is a senior lecturer in Holocaust Studies in the Department of History at Royal Holloway, University of London. At Royal Holloway, she is the Deputy Director of the Holocaust Research Institute and also affiliated with the Center for Geohumanities and the Center for Oratory and Rhetoric. In addition to journal articles and chapters on spatial history, photography, film, and testimony, her book publications include The Train Journey, Transit, Captivity, and Witnessing in the Holocaust, published in 2009, and the co-edited volumes, The Young Victims of the Nazi Regime, Migration, the Holocaust, and Post-War Displacement, published in 2016. A Companion to the Holocaust, published in 2020, and The Holocaust in the 21st Century, Relevance and Challenges in the Digital Age, also this year. So handing over to you, Simone. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Christine, and for that introduction, and welcome to all participants from across the world, and as Christine has mentioned, from PhD students to professors, to this co-hosted online workshop on exploring Holocaust photography with Professor David Shneer from the University of Colorado, Boulder. So as Christine said, I'm Simone Gigliotti, and I'll be chairing the session and working with Christine in facilitating the presentation and the Q&A. So based on your reasons for joining this workshop, it's clear that photography from the Nazi era continues to provoke, stimulate, and divide opinion. The questions that we posed in the workshop call for applicants, productive entry points to image analysis in diverse contexts. Those questions, for the benefit of participants and our recording, are: how did Soviet photographers individualize and universalize the horror of the Holocaust? To what extent can their photographs of grief be read as multi-layered commentaries on Soviet, Jewish, and human identity? And why did these photographers develop a type of post-realist narrative of suffering as a visual commodity, and how it was received or contested? So to guide us visually through these questions, it's now my pleasure to introduce Professor David Shneer. I want to thank him for making time in his schedule to be here today. It is his early morning in Colorado, and I'm aware late evening, if not midnight, for Australia and other countries. So thank you very much for being up and staying up. So David is the Louis P. Singer Endowed Chair in Jewish History, Professor of History and Jewish Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. He is a distinguished lecturer for the Association of Jewish Studies, faculty advisor for Yiddishkeit, co-editor-in-chief of East European Jewish Affairs, the academic director of Colorado University Boulder's Post-Holocaust American Judaism Archive, and the 2021 American Council of Learned Societies Fellow. David's forthcoming book is called Grief, the Biography of a Holocaust Photograph. It's to be published by Oxford University Press in August or October, as I've looked on the website, but it's coming, and it's something very much to be welcomed, and I think a really viable, valuable contribution to the field, and it provides the context for this afternoon's workshop. And with that in mind, I'll now hand you over to David to begin.
Thank you, Christine. And can you all hear me? Excellent. So I want to thank Dr. Christine Schmidt, Director of Research at the Wiener Library, and Dr. Simone Gigliotti, Senior Lecturer at Royal Holloway, University of London, for the invitation to come and speak to you about exploring Holocaust photography and perhaps incorporating it into your teaching. And I actually looked at a bunch of your sort of biographies about why you're wanting to do this. And I'm actually really excited to be having a conversation with you in addition to me presenting you with this information. So I'm going to be speaking for maybe 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation about how we can use these kinds of exploring Holocaust photography in our classroom. So in this pedagogy seminar about Holocaust photography, I want to focus on how I never incorporate photographies of the dead unless there's a reason. And so I saw a number of you I'm worried about having images of the dead in my presentations, in my public lectures. And I just make sure at the very beginning, day one, I always make sure to say, I'm not going to expose you to the dead unless there's a reason. So we can talk about that. I call it necropornography. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. In this pedagogy seminar, I focus in on three aspects of Holocaust photography. The first is the biography of a photographer. Too often we look at photographs that talk a lot about the subject of a photograph. So an Arbeit macht frei photographs or images of liberation. But we rarely hear about the photographer who photographs the subjects and presents it to the viewer, and that's you. So Ariella Azoulay's theory of the photographic moment reminds us that we need to think about not two individuals, the subject and the viewer, but the photographer themselves. So the second one is text versus context, or the image and the text that surrounds the image. We will look at how the image and the caption or the photograph surrounding the image do not necessarily state what is in the photograph. And we'll talk a little bit about how the image looks versus the caption. And last, we will talk about the history and memory as we delve into one photographer's historical photographs and ask how he made them memorial images to atrocity. All right, so let's start with Evgeni Khaldei. We'll talk about the biography of a photographer first to see how he's photographing, what he is photographing shapes how he's photographing. So this is a picture of Reichstag in Berlin in May 2nd, 1945, and he is standing here before these people looking up at the Reichstag. So Evgeni Khaldei was a Soviet photographer who was Jewish, who took photographs of World War II and the Holocaust. And I'll give you a better sense of who he is and why the biography matters. So born in 1917, his mother was killed during a pogrom in Yuzovka, which is going to become Stalina in 1933, and it's going to become Lugansk in 1961. So it's going to have three different names over 3 periods of time. He took his first picture when he was 16 of a blown up cathedral in Yuzovka, now called Stalina. In 1936, he got an invitation to come to Moscow to photograph for the Telegraph Agency of the Soviet Union, or TASS, a position he held throughout World War II. And so you can see here on the left, you have Evgeni Khaldei as a 1940, so he's like 23 years old there. You can see the arrow with him, and then 4 years later in Sevastopol, which is when it was liberated in 1944. And you can see how he's standing on the roof. So he got his start on the first day of battle in June 22nd, 1941. He got called late to the office. Other photographers had gotten their head start on the factory floor, where they came to photograph these speeches at noon that they were announced that they were going to war. Khaldei was a little bit late to do that. So this is him showing up at noon at the TASS studios. And you can see this wasn't published until 1995, but he captures the ambiguous nature of the declaration of war, as you see one woman looking up, another man with his hands in his pockets, and another woman right here, sort of with her hand on her mouth, sort of expressing a sorrow that they're now going to war. And I talk about this as a way to get students into the photographer and then into the photograph. So he photographed the bombing of Murmansk in June 1942. So these here are chimneys, and that's all that is left of the city of Murmansk. And you have this lone woman who's walking by through the city of Murmansk, and he has a couple of pictures of her, and he turns around and she yells at him like, "Why are you not doing something to get us out of this war?" And he responds, I'm photographing your suffering." In 1945, he took photographs of Budapest, Hungary, as we see Stalin's face here going up as these refugees right here are bringing back their booty from the rural areas to the capital. Khaldei photographs a Soviet soldier in the form of socialist realism as he is below the subject, who is looking off towards the right. So you can see he's sort of framing him from below and he's looking off to the right. I show this because I want students to know that Khaldei was photographing in socialist realist style, and he was damn good at it. Then I show how he went to the Budapest ghetto. So this is the Budapest Jewish ghetto to photograph this couple and a number of other scenes in the Budapest ghetto. Although scholars and art historians have said that this wasn't published in the Soviet Union, I found it in the Yiddish language Soviet newspaper Einigkeit, or Unity, in 1945. But you'll talk a little bit about how you can see these images and how his biography helps inform these images. I also show them the six-pointed star you can see right here, to show that these murdered Jews in a Budapest synagogue were actually Jewish, live Jewish people. Now, this is beyond the Soviet Union, so there's maybe some kind of question about the internationalization of the Soviet Union's discussing of the Holocaust, but these are nonetheless Jews in a Budapest synagogue. And then I show them this coup de grace, the raising of the red flag over the Reichstag on May 2nd. Khaldei went back to Moscow to get a red blanket to sort of sew on like a five-pointed star, and you can see a hammer and sickle. And he got to the Reichstag on May 2nd. He carried them up with two soldiers. And when he saw the edge of the building, he encouraged the flag waver to stand just beyond the cupola. That's this guy right here. And so we have a number of photographs where he takes a picture and it's basically right, whoops, it's basically right here. And he's like, you know what, go further out, this guy right here. He's like, I don't want to go further out. And so he's like, all right, this guy, you can see right here, he hangs onto his feet, and he sort of leans over and tries to stick out the photograph, the flag in larger detail. And so he got this photograph. He develops it, sends it back to Moscow, and he realizes that there are two watches on this photograph, which means he was a looter. Now, everybody knows that Russians were looting Germans as the war was going on, especially in January 1945 to May 1945. But you don't want to have the hero of the Soviet Union have a looter in its proximity. So you wait until May 13th, and then you have the two photographs. So this is the one on the left is this one, and this is the one on the right, victory banner over Berlin. And so you can see a little bit how, so this is showing how it's only got one photograph, one watch here. And so this is kind of like a photo retoucher, or in today's parlance, a Photoshop would do. So we have Photoshop today, but we like, how do you make photographs that sort of got rid of things that were not allowed to be seen? So you had photo retouchers. That's what was called back. That's what they were called back then. Okay, so that's a little bit about how biography will sort of inform what you're going to be doing in the classroom. Okay, so text versus context. So this is this photograph here, and I'm going to read you this quote down here. So, the scarlet banner flies over the Reichstag in the center of the fascist capital, Berlin. Berlin has fallen. She lies subdued at the feet of the victorious Soviet soldiers. The stronghold of international reaction, the hearth of German aggression. The Red Army not only won a great historical victory in the battle for Berlin, it brought liberation to suffering humanity from fascist darkness. The day of May 2nd, 1945 will forever go down in history and will be remembered for centuries. So this is the text or the caption that goes on this photograph. Now this photograph, by the way, will go forever and always on magnets, on photographs, including on billboards. But this is the original photograph from May 13th, 1945. And so it seems like, I often point out that there is no more Hitlerite fascist Berlin is a communist way of saying Nazi Germany has fallen. But they're sort of making it this universal way of approaching this subject, especially when you see it brought liberation to suffering humanity from fascist darkness. I also point out that fascist darkness is a way of saying Soviet light and a way to turn towards the future. So this is May 13th, 1945, and the photograph has none of that in the image. Rather, it is the way the photo editor makes this image a reality. So this is a kind of image that you could use in a classroom. So Khaldei is also one of the first photographers who photographs the first Holocaust liberation site in Kerch in January 1942. So at the top here's a photograph of him. At the top, the Soviet Army magazine says, "Take revenge, Atamstim." There's absolutely nothing in the picture that lets you know what is going on, except that there is a man mourning over a murdered woman and child. Wouldn't it help you to know that in the Soviet Red Army paper, there was the following caption from Khaldei: Grigory Berman mourns murdered wife and children. So picture this without the Atamstim. So this would just be a picture of grief and mourning, and the mourning of the loss of a man, mourning over the murdered wife and children. The word "we will get revenge," on the other hand, suggests that this photograph is about getting revenge. Who knows what a Soviet soldier would have said when he saw this? That maybe a Soviet man is weeping for his loved ones and we must get revenge? Or that a Jewish man, Grigory Berman, is weeping for his loved ones and we must get revenge? We don't really know, and that's what makes this such an exciting photograph. Okay, so section 3 is about history and memory, and I'm going to take you through this photograph here of Dmitri Baltermantz's grief, which I'm writing about in this book. So Dmitri Baltermantz takes this use of chronology to place the photograph. He was there photographing the first Holocaust liberation site in Kerch in January 1942, and Baltermantz and Khaldei were both standing on the same site as they were photographing this site in January 2nd, 1942. So he took this picture of P. Ivanova, you can see her right here, found her husband tortured to death by the fascist executioners. And you can see this is yellow, And it's from the newspaper that I found at the Library of Congress. And so you can see it was published, so it was taken January 2nd, 1942, but it was only published 2 months later on March 6th, 1943. So that was the one time it was published during the war. And it was meant to sort of get revenge. 20 years later, when Baltermans brought out the photograph as a symbol of memory, he saw the 4 photographs he took of Ivanova. You can see that the editor picked the 4th one right here. But the 3rd one has more pathos in it. And the 3rd one was what Baltermans agreed was the best photograph yet of these 4 images. So we went back to that one to try and make it a symbol. But you can see that when he got developed in Kerch at a sort of makeshift darkroom in Kerch, that he ended up messing up the photograph. So you can see these white dots here, and there's this like white stain right here. So you can see that the 2 marks at the top and the white spot on the upper third of the photograph. So you can see that this is what it would have looked like had it not been corrected. So you can see black spots, white stain, and white stains all over the place. But you can see how this sort of image has this sort of grandiosity to it. So he took 2 negatives and photographed them together to make one image. So you take one image, you take this piece, you cut down through there, and you put a different image on top of that, and you create one image out of it. So this one at the Hood Museum at Dartmouth College has a documentary look to it, as the sky looks white, like the original photograph. So you can see how it's kind of white and gray, and this one's kind of white and gray. But Baltermans didn't really like this one. So we tried a different sky to make it a bit more ominous. And you can see here, you can see this woman is crying over the murdered husband, but you can also see this woman here, and you can see her shadow in this pool of blood, which maybe looks kind of like a shadow, or maybe more like a mirror, sort of reflecting off of herself. But he tried again for a 3rd version. So this is the one that came down in history books as grief. There was nothing on it, not a name, not a place, just grief. Here, P.I. Ivanova mourns over her loved one was nothing more than grief. And it was named Time's top 100 photographs in the 20th century. So this is one of the top 100 photographs of Time magazine. And so this is what it looked like. And so I was going to put in a photograph from Aganyok, and it was a 20th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, the camp where 1.1 million Jews, Roma, and others were murdered. And rather than saying grief, you know what, I'm going to actually show it to you. Hold on one second. Let me find the... Let me find the photograph. Hold on one second. Okay. Can you see this photograph right now? So this photograph, it was from 20th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And rather than saying grief, it says, "We will not forget, nikogda nie zabudim," down the side of the page. And then in small print, you can see right here, there's a statement by German Pulitzer Prize winning writer Heinrich Böll. And then in this area right here, you can see it says, the quote is January 1942, Kerch. Retreating fascist troops shot dead thousands of peaceful residents near the city and dumped their bodies in an anti-tank ditch. And then in quotes, women on the field of battle search among the dead for those close to them. Their cry stops being their own. It becomes the cry of humanity, said Heinrich Böll about this photograph. So as we move from a historical photograph into an image of memory, the name P. Ivanova is lost, and women scream out their cry of humanity. All right, so now let me put back this photograph. And then let me just show you one last thing about history and memory. So this is a place called Katyn. This is a photograph of a German discovery of Katyn in April 1943. And they brought a whole bunch of international diplomats to this scene to show what the Soviet army was capable of doing. So you look at this, it's just a photograph of, presumably these are dead bodies, but we can't really tell what they are. So these are sort of a broad scope of German atrocities discovery of Soviet atrocities at Katyn in April 1943. And you can see a couple of their feet right here. Okay, but then we have this with a few Soviet soldiers up here and a giant pit in the forest. And this is called the Soviet liberation of Katyn 1 year later in 1944. You cannot tell which one is the Soviet one and which one is the German one. And that's why I like using this photograph. You can't tell the difference between the German and the Soviet photographs, leaving it to the photo editor to capture your attention to the difference between the German and the Soviet photographs. Nothing at all that it says German and Soviet photographs. So I hope I've shown you how knowledge of the photographer can create new approaches to Holocaust photography, how an image is only shaped by the meanings entailed by research done about that photograph, and how historical photography only goes as far as that moment in history. When a photograph comes back out, for example, for Baltermans in the 1960s, it serves as a memory photograph and as a potential reminder that due to the 27 million people killed during the war with fascist Germany, and 1.5 of them Jews, the Soviet Union needs to be the bearer of peace, with women bearing the cry of humanity. Okay, so now I will take comments from you, and I'm going to keep this open, but I'm going to unshare the screen, but I'm going to keep it open so you guys can see the screen. Does that work for everybody? Okay.
So David, there is one question in the chat box that's just come up from Jadwiga. So some of the questions are coming now. So one question is, do you have any suggestions and pointers for engaging with Holocaust photography when either the photographer is unknown or little known?
Yeah, so I actually do that with, I actually really do my best to basically find out the biographies of the photographs I'm going to be using. So I generally don't use photographs that I do not know who is going to be used. If I am going to be using that photograph, I will put up unknown, comma, and the title of the photograph, and then the year. And usually I make a note in class that I say that I don't know the name of the photographer, but you should know the name of the photographer. Does that help?
Yeah, I mean, given that many Holocaust photographs don't have any photographers attached to them.
Right, and I tend not to use those. Although, so some people can actually use those and actually say, look, we don't have any idea who these people are. The issue is the subject of the photograph, not the photographer behind the subject of the photograph. And that actually makes it a little bit more vernacular, which I think means more like homey and everyday. So it basically sort of puts the focus on the subject rather than on the photographer. Okay, let's see.
So another question that's come up is from Matt, and he says, students will likely note that the photograph grief displays recent execution. Soviet viewers would have perhaps made the judgment that revenge was near because the killers had only recently departed and Soviet liberation was near. What might we say about the power of this image versus images of bodies in a mass grave of deaths that occurred months or years ago?
So I think you're talking about the sort of Soviet executions in 1937, 38 versus this, which is 1941, 42. Is that, yes?
That's
Is that
to
right?
Matt. Is he there? He can comment further.
Matt, sorry, there you are. Can you just unmute your mic?
No, I mean the photographs at Kirch in 1942.
Right, so you're talking about these Kerch photographs that are from 1942, but you're talking about not like, there might have been photographs of dead bodies before in like 1937 when Soviet NKVD officers came and shot.
I guess I'm talking about, yeah, or images that are not circulated at the time, but of Babi Yar and other places of mass graves elsewhere in Ukraine and Belarus.
Okay,
where,
so Kerch happens in 1942, and actually
right.
Kerch becomes the symbol of the fascist atrocities against the Soviet Union, parentheses, and Jews, until Babi Yar in 1943. And then Kerch will be quickly forgotten, and Babi Yar will become the main sort of killing site or killing fields in terms of Soviet memory. Does that help?
Right, but the killings themselves occur in September of 1941. So to me, there's a difference between images of killings that have just occurred, right? And Soviet troops come, I assume, I don't know the specific details of Kerch, but come to the execution site soon after execution has happened. There's a different sort of resonance to those photos because it implies the Soviet army is indeed on the march and can stop these killers. They're hot on their trail. Whereas Babi Yar is a very, very different sort of context.
Right, so this Kerch area was only occupied for 45 days. So
right.
This was the very first, so it was occupied in November 1941, and it was liberated in late December 1941. So it was only 45 days. Babi Yar was occupied from mid-September all the way until early November 1943. So it was occupied for 2 years. So this was in a way, a sort of way to sort of have the Soviet Union sort of get revenge on Nazi atrocities, fascist atrocities, to put it correctly. Where when they come across Babi Yar, they actually don't see anything because they've already, the Germans have already burned the bodies in the ground because they see that they're coming. So they don't really have a lot of these kinds of photographs here. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, David, we've got a range of questions coming through that talk about, I guess, the perspective of the photographer, so perpetrator, victim, witness, observer, bystander, and then one from Janine Hulk, which is, I think, kind of unique. It's kind of like looking at the afterlife of the photograph. So she said, can you comment on the additional journey of the photograph into archives or collections so that one or even many more participants recontextualize it?
So I'll answer that, and then I'll go back to the other question. Okay. So that's actually what this whole book is about the sort of photographic moments when the photographer and this photograph meet on this, it's like an empty field near Kerch, and it actually traces it forward in time up to where the archive is sitting in the US Holocaust Memorial Museum's archive. I interviewed archivists, curators, and collectors who all collect this photograph and have it in their archives. So yes, I'm able to talk about that sort of a movement of photography from a sort of historical documentary photograph, which appeared in newspapers, to the 1960s, where it appears as an art photograph. Still not worth anything, though. And then in the 1990s, when sort of the photography market starts to gain steam, then this photograph appears right here, appears on the market, and it's well worth 5 figures. So I can talk about how it goes from documentary to art photography to like a valuable commodity in the marketplace.
Mm.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and Janine can buy the book too, David, right?
Exactly. So then you're asking about the photographers and whether they are perpetrators, liberators, or I guess bystanders, although I don't know how a photographer could actually be a bystander if they're actually bearing witness on the Holocaust.
And David, just to say, Daniela kind of, her question is sort of in addition to that, talking about the differences in points of view between German, Soviet, and Jewish photographers. So all of these different perspectives, if you could add that into the mix.
Sure. So yeah, so this is a Soviet photograph. Look, this guy is Jewish. He's raised in a pogrom-ridden town in the 1920s. So he has a particular experience that he identifies with as he's photographing this war. A German photographer would have a very different perspective, but I always want to get in the heads of the photographers. So what is a German photographer? Let's take Heinrich Joest, who photographs the Warsaw Ghetto in September 1941. He goes out on his birthday and he basically photographs the ghetto, including like one dead woman and another cemetery. What is he thinking? I don't actually have the students basically sort of put your perpetrator hat on and your liberator hat on. I actually asked them to think about what is the person thinking. And so he's probably thinking, look, these people are sort of smiling at me in the Jewish ghetto. Well, I wonder why that is. Probably because he knew that they would be getting caught and probably being killed if he knew that they didn't like sort of smile and stand up straight. So I just think of it that way. So German, Jewish, Soviet. So it's putting yourself into the perspective of the photographer. So let's take Mendel Grossman from the Warsaw Ghetto. So he was a photographer for the Warsaw Ghetto's demographics team. He was taking pictures of sort of ID pictures, but then he was also taking pictures of people having celebrations, people having like people enjoying their time out, and people were these were exhibited in, I think it was Toronto, and people were actually asking, is it really appropriate to show how the Jewish ghetto was showing such like vibrancy amongst the Jews? And the answer is, I think yes, because only with the perspective of this Jewish photographer do we actually see these kinds of joys and pitfalls of the Jewish photographers.
So there's another question here that is from Katie. She says, in recent years, a number of photos taken clandestinely have been discovered. Could you comment upon the potential of photographs to be an action/product of deliberate witnessing?
So it's a question I've had a long time thinking about. First, you would have to know who took those photographs. So I would say encourage somebody to actually go figure out who took those photographs, and then figure out whether they were, I guess you're talking about like the Auschwitz album, for example. I don't know specifically if that's what you're talking about, but I think that came out in like, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago. But figure out who took those pictures. Actually, it turned out to be Germans photographing their own sort of, their, I guess what's the word I'm looking for? Their happiness at being at Auschwitz. And yes, then you can actually charge blame to those people who were photographing it at Auschwitz. But I don't, and I guess I don't see so the issue of witnessing and the idea of witnessing is already, it's a piece of a puzzle that's already being broken down into the photograph. So if you see the Auschwitz album, there's a piece of a photograph, but then there might be a piece going beyond that, like beyond the photograph itself. So there might be a wider and wider version of that photograph to show, for example, Jews laying dead Jews laying next to these guys, but you know, you don't want to actually get those in the picture. You want to focus on these German soldiers. I'm just thinking out loud here.
Yeah, I think that was a comment from Alistair as well, picking up on what you said about Auschwitz, and what, just in the brief comment in the chat, he said, what are your thoughts about if the subject of the photo does not or did not want their image to be in the public domain? Should archives respect that view and withdraw them from public viewing? Also, if the subject was murdered, we can never know if they consent. I think this is a challenge for us.
I think it's very much a challenge for us. Alistair, that's definitely a response that I clearly have. So I don't know if these people actually had consent, because they're dead. I mean, they don't have the ability to speak. And so, like, when archives sort of show these things, I ask them, do you have permission from the respondent to show these pictures? And they're like, well, no, because they're dead. I'm like, so think about that. I mean, that's an ethical issue about how we use photographs. So if people wanted to give consent for these images, I mean, they can't obviously, but if they wanted to give consent, maybe many of them would not give consent, and then we would close down all of these archives for lack of consent of being willing to show photographs. So just that's aside, the story I'm thinking of right now, it's coming from 2015 in Paris, which the bombing, Paris bombing. And there was a photograph that was taken the next morning by a woman whose name I cannot remember, of a dead cafe drinker in front of Le Balaclava. And the woman sued the photographer, basically not giving consent to have the photograph taken. And so the photographer said, but this is public domain. This is a person who was involved in this mass terrorist attack. And so this photograph needs to be out in the public, and therefore it needs to be photographed. And so they went back at it, and actually she won the photograph because she felt like it was in the public domain. So I guess I see that as a little bit of this exploring Holocaust photography, about how you think about consent versus the sort of public domain. Oh, and was there another question? Sorry.
Yeah, there's some more in the, I don't know if Christine wants
Yeah,
to.
I can jump in with Anna Vaprinska asks, actually, if we can turn back to the reception of photography by the students. She is asking what you might suggest as coping strategies for students who say they find a particular photograph or perhaps a series of photographs traumatizing.
So yeah, so I will always, so at the beginning of class, at the very beginning of the 15-week semester, I always say, I'm going to show you photographs that are going to be a bit disturbing. You guys can please leave if you want to leave, and feel free not to come back. But I do also say, so I actually make very clear that I don't show photographs of the dead unless there's a reason. So this, for example, this is a reason because these dead obviously have people mourning over them, and you can't really see that they're dead. I can show you some photographs of Baltermans that have like really close-ups of like, they're horrible pictures. I don't show them in class. I show these kinds of photographs where I can actually sort of respond to the student who says, I have a problem with this. I don't like the fact that you have the dead person right here. I'm like, okay, then you should just leave, and no problem with that. I'm showing this because I want to see how she sort of mourn over their dead husbands. But actually, this is I've taught this class. I used to teach this class at the old university I was at, and this is the second time I've been teaching it. And it's a 150 student class. So it's a really large class. And I taught it the first time 3 years ago. And I didn't really have a good sense of, like, 150 student class is a really big class. And I didn't really have a sense of how the students would handle this material. And so I got a lot of feedback from the students saying, you know, this is too much. It was just way too much. So this time, it was Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And on Monday mornings at 9 o'clock, 50 minutes, the very first minute, we had the lights down, and I just did a meditation. we just stared at a blank screen with a flame on it. And actually, so the students, now I have seen the students, they responded immensely well to having seen that meditation and having sort of therefore gotten through the meditation. Therefore, we can move forward on seeing these kinds of photographs. It's just a way I sort of think about pedagogy and try to think about my experience as a student.
Thank you. I think hopefully that answered Anna's question. I think it's really an interesting approach, and I think obviously leaving that space for reflection probably helps quite a bit with coping with these strong visual images. Just moving on to Paul's question. He is also asking about the use of photographs as evidence, either for legal or historical purposes, and about the transition from history to memory in the presentation of photographs. And he just added that he knows little about Soviet uses of photographs in legal proceedings outside the IMT at Nuremberg. So do you talk to your students about that?
So yes, I do talk to my students about that. So for example, this photograph right here, actually not this photograph, it was this photograph right here, before it became the sort of grand art photograph. This was actually used in the Nuremberg trials, in the IMT trials. Not to show that anybody did anything wrong. Like, she could be a Soviet woman looking over her dead husband, and it could have been a Soviet soldier who could have made the person dead. This came about that it was a fascist executioner. But this was really about sort of creating an ambiance in that courtroom to sort of have the Germans really feel remorse about what they had done in the Soviet Union. But they used Kerch extraordinary commission files, which are the, so what happens was the Soviet Union would liberate a city, and then they would do an investigation in that city that was under German occupation, and they would call them extraordinary commission reports. And so they would basically have demographers, forensic researchers, photographers, and the Soviet secret police, or NKVD, that would then organize witnesses around what took place in this city. And by the way, at USHMM, the US Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, they have hundreds of photographs, hundreds of extraordinary commission reports that have endless amounts of material. And in Kerch, for example, I found at least 100 witnesses to the actual trial in 1944. So in 1942, so Kerch was liberated in December 1941. It was reoccupied in May 1942. So they didn't yet have the extraordinary commission reports yet. Then it was re-liberated in April 1944. They had those extraordinary commissions. The extraordinary commissions were started in December 1942. So they only had in 1944. They did not have in 1942. So they only had in 1944, but they had hundreds of witnesses saying, what did you experience here? So the answer to your question is yes, they use these pictures a lot in wartime testimony. Let's see which ones. So let's see, this would be used in a place called, it would be in a place called Budapest. This probably would not have been used because it didn't really show the sort of Jewish angle of the atrocities that took place. But yes, this picture definitely would have been shown in trials. And there's nothing to say that this was a German, this was obviously a Soviet liberator taking this picture. And actually, a quick funny story about this is Khaldei comes up to these people in January 1945 and says, and he's got his like leather coat on, he's got his like gun in the pocket. He doesn't know, like these people don't know whether he's Nazi or German, Nazi German or Soviet. And he's like, hey, I want to take your photograph. And they're like, oh, okay. And so they put on these coats, and she's like, oh, yeah. Put on those coats because we're going to be celebrating victory. She's like, what? And she's like, she says to him, what's going on? And he says to her, ich bin do, which means in Yiddish, I am here. in Yiddish. So it's not it's a vernacular Jewish language. And so they give each other hugs. He photographs them 4 times, and then they take this picture. But he sort of reveals himself as a Jew in that moment. But this picture really could have been seen in a like a Hungarian trial, for example.
And then the next question, I'm just going through this. If you haven't been looking at the chat, everyone, there's some really good questions posed and some kind of sidebar discussions. So be sure to check out the
I would
chat.
recommend, by the way, you should take a picture of this chat and just copy it in your browser.
Yeah, because there's some great resources being shared as well. So Danielle is asking if in your classes you've shown other photos from other genocides as well.
Yes, I do show them from other genocides. I show them from, I think, every other genocide. I really believe in the power of photographs, but I always believe in knowing who the photographer is. I don't usually have that for these other photographs, but I do have them for the Holocaust photographs. But I actually do sort of make an effort about, say, I take Cambodian photographs, and I actually look up who the photographer was in the Cambodian photograph and actually study why he took that picture. So yes, I do.
Simone, did you want to pick up you actually you posted a really good question. I don't know if you want to ask it.
Yeah, David, I've said that given that you've written an entire book on the biography of a photograph, what do you think are useful strategies for incorporating different images into student learning? For example, for them to research a photo's biography as part of a learning exercise or as part of an assessment. And would this photo come from a collection as part of a visual gallery, as the ones that you presented, and to explore all of the issues you've alluded to? Is it too much to expect students to really grasp what photos can represent without studies of intent and context, and making reference to genealogy, reception, and studies of circulation? And then I asked, thus, should there be an ethics of pedagogy in relation to using and learning about photographs in the Holocaust classroom?
Okay, so I believe that a photograph can stand on its own. Mm-hmm. So I believe that you can actually have your students do a photograph like this particular image about Khaldei in a classroom. So maybe you could call it Holocaust photography, and you could have this be the final project of the students. But I also believe, so ethics of pedagogy, you talk about all of these unlayered foldings of context, of intent. They need to learn that over the course of the 15 weeks. So they need to start out with, what's the picture? Why don't we start with just a picture? And then we can move back to, what do you see in the picture? And then we can move back to, who's the picture by? And then we can move back to et cetera, et cetera. And then we can sort of come to a full conclusion about who the photographer is and how did he take this photograph. We don't often know actually how people took photographs. So for example, this story comes from Khaldei himself. I don't even know if it's true. It's a good story. I don't know if it's true, but it's a good story, and we can use it to sort of suggest that he sort of reveals himself as a Jew after the fall of the Soviet Union, whereas before, in the Soviet period, he might not have revealed himself as a Jew. He might have just revealed himself as a Soviet photographer who's taking pictures of these people who were Jewish. So Simone, I don't have an answer for that question. I guess I would say, look, everybody is surrounded by pictures. So we have to figure out how to develop visual literacy. And I feel like we can do this through Holocaust photography.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I only do it because I have photo exercises in my teaching as well, where students have to curate their own visual galleries. Mm-hmm. And they
think that's great.
And research, and they present, and they justify why they chose these photographs, but with the necessary research in the background, so contextualize it. So one of the other questions that I think is important, which kind of goes to what you're saying, is do you explore the relation of the photograph with its propaganda purposes and intent?
Yes. And I see Ella's like really going on this one. So I I don't actually use the word propaganda. I don't, because in general, I don't believe, so propaganda exists, and propaganda was actually a main Soviet form of sort of communicating ideology. But I don't usually believe that photographs were taken for propaganda purposes. I believe that, for example, this guy, this is classic socialist realist photography, sort of photographing from below up to the sky. He's looking off in the distance. Like, this is classic photographic realism, sorry, socialist realism. But I don't believe that this is a photograph any more than, say, the raising of the American flag over Mount Suribachi is any more a sort of propaganda photograph than this is. I believe that all photographs are sort of composed, and so this guy, let's see, what did he crop out? Let's see, he cropped out maybe, I don't actually know what he cropped out, but maybe he cropped out right over here, a crying woman sobbing with her dead husband. He just cropped her out. Or maybe you'll see that this picture actually includes her. And then they just cut out the photograph of the Soviet soldier so we can put that into propaganda purposes and get rid of the dead woman. So regarding photographs used for propaganda, and how do we differentiate perspectives in the classroom? So I actually don't differentiate perspectives in the classroom. I actually look at the photograph itself and actually ask, what is this photograph doing? And how is this photograph migrating through time? So for example, this photograph might have appeared in Pravda, the Soviet Party newspaper. And it might have appeared as like, great Soviet soldier arrives in Berlin, while there might have been a dead woman next to him. But this is the only photograph that is of him, and it's therefore published as a sort of great propaganda photograph. Does that make sense?
Yeah. One of the other questions relates to photo editing. The question is, how do your students react to the issue of photo editing? I've come across a few in my own research from the French case that have been clearly edited at different points, play down, and then later highlight the Jewish identity of the pictured subjects. Yeah,
so let me show you, let's see. No, I don't have, hold on, let me stop share. And I'm going to find a photograph for you that actually gets at that very image. Hold on. Okay, so you see this photo? This photo here? So this is a photo essay with 3 different photographers put into this photo essay. So I actually talked to the students about this photograph in my class. So this photograph, let's see, this photograph, this photograph, this photograph, and this photograph come from Baltermans. This photograph, and this photograph do not come from Baltermans. I think they come from 2 people and 1 person right here. So how do you imagine that this photo editor is going to put together all of these images as one collective whole with 8 photographs? So it says Hitlerite atrocities in Kerch. What the hell does that mean? Like, that's across the top of the page. So you can see that actually the photo editor has much more power than the photographer himself to actually let people know what's going on in the papers. So you can see that the photo editor is choosing Tereshenko right here, Afanasieva right here, and this is Ivanova. But she's also picking like these horrible images of dead bodies. And then she's picking 1, 2, 3. So this is Afanasieva, and this is 2 people who are Crimean Tatar. Those are people who are mourning over their dead. How do we know what the photo editor is doing with this? Basically, the photo editor is basically seeing it as everybody's atrocity. So we've got the, so this is Tereshenko, who's Ukrainian, mourning over her dead husband, Kogan, which is Cohen, which is Jewish, with Ivanova, Russian, Afanasieva, Russian, Crimean Tatar. This is everybody's atrocity. So whether or not the photographers photographed what they took at Kerch, the photo editor is the one who's putting it into place.
Thanks, David. There was a follow-up question. I'm not sure if it can be answered right now, but Matt asked, it still strikes me that Kirsch has a particular import because the photographed bodies have individuality and thus a particular resonance in a court setting, as horrific as photos of mass graves are.
Yes, and I don't, so actually, let me go back to that photograph. So this photograph, we don't know who these people are. We don't know who any of these, so these people right here, this is unidentified Jews. Like, and we know that they're unidentified because there were no Jews in the area except 6 Jewish doctors who were saved by the Germans because they wanted to basically have health care. So this is unidentified Jews. So we have these unidentified Jews that are getting sent to the IMT, to the Nuremberg trials, and it just says unidentified Jews. So yes, we have Ivanova, Tereshchenko, and Afanasyeva, but we don't have so much information about unidentified Jews, but they can actually be presented in trial such that, look, Jews were also being persecuted. Wrong choice.
Okay. One question, I'm going to get back to the student kind of learning resources. I'll do that after this one because it follows on. Emanuela says, if the photo editor has so much power in conveying a particular message, why don't you also name them and search for more info about who they were?
I would really love to do that. Actually, I would really, really love to do that. I just don't have enough information about the photo editors. I happen to know this photo, actually, I don't even know this photo editor's name. This photo editor was at Aganyok. I don't even know his name. I actually don't even know who he's actually going to respond to. I happen to know that in the American context, Nadia Baer just wrote a book on the Magnum photographers, and they actually work really closely with their photo editors, and they all have names. So she actually works really closely with the photo editors, the photographers, and the publishers to actually figure out how a photographer takes a picture, it gets sent to the photo editor, and then it gets sent out into the wider world. I don't have any of that information, but you're exactly right. I should know who these photo editors are.
Okay, and one of the other questions is, can you share any resources that you've used for helping students learn how to do this kind of photographic analysis?
So I've used my book, Through Soviet Jewish Eyes, but I tend not to use my books just because I don't like using them in class in any case. So I tend to use Irina Struk's book. God, what's it called? Yeah, you guys know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, Photographing the Holocaust.
There we go, Photographing the Holocaust. And, oh man, she's at University of Pennsylvania.
Oh, Barbie Zelizer.
Yes, and Barbie Zelizer's Remembering the Holocaust.
Holocaust, yeah.
So I try to use those 2 books as ways at getting at some of the challenges about using photography. I don't find them really sort of capturing what I'm doing myself, which is sort of, they basically say, look, this photograph has no caption, and look, it got used in all sorts of other ways. But they don't actually tell you what the biography of the photographer was actually talking about. Mm. So I find those useful, but not completely sufficient.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's it's specific to your particular area too, I think, in relation to Soviet Holocaust photography. And whatnot. But my question was, one of the earlier photos you showed, I can't remember where it was the woman, and you said that she asked the photographer, why don't you do something?
Yes, I'm going to show you that photo. This right here. Yeah, so, oh, and she said, right, why don't you do something? So his response, oh, do you have a
yeah, so the question
okay.
is, I mean, there were very famous I'm thinking about war photojournalists and genocide, and there was a very famous one, or a famine, you know, photographers taking photos of children and whatnot. But the issue was of, you know, the child, I'm looking for the photo, I'm going to post it. But what do you think the responsibility of the photographer, photojournalist is in those contexts? But in a way, your photographer, Khaldei, was almost shielding himself, documenting, yes, what is the responsibility between documentation and intervention? Or did he see his documentation as a form of intervention, even though it was highly aestheticized?
So you're exactly right. So he saw himself as documenting with the form of intervening. So she basically turned around. So he took this photograph maybe 5 times. So she's walking along, she turns around, she sits down on it's on the other side of her suitcase. And she says, "Why are you doing this to me? Why are you photographing me? Why don't you go fight the war?" And he's like, I'm photographing you in order to fight the war. So these photographs would end up in the papers, and they would basically end up sort of being part of the Soviet, I guess the Soviet enterprise to get revenge. Now this is June 1942. You guys know that in June 1942, the world was looking really bleak for the Soviet Union. So in other words, Khaldei is really having to make do with what he has. Oops. Because in June 1942, the Germans were already in control of the Caucasus, in control of like surrounding Leningrad, and actually all the way further down to Stalingrad. So they were really looking bad. So you got to imagine that he sort of is hoping in June 1942 that this photograph is going to sort of rally the troops to get revenge. So that's the way I'm going to respond to your question, which is.
So it's a form of like mobilization, visual mobilization, or kind of incitement to action.
Yes, and he didn't know whether this photograph was even going to be published. And in fact, it was not published. It was published with like 5 other photographs with the city of Murmansk in it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And there's another question that's come up in the chat. The question is, you are doing, or it should be, are you doing a social history of photographers as historical actors?
Yes, I am doing a social history of photographers here. So this is my first book. So I did the social history of photographers. I studied 24 Soviet Jewish in parentheses photographers. Where I got to this new project is somebody asked me, can you talk a little bit about the Warburg complex? I'm like, I have no idea who Warburg is. So I did a little bit of reading and I figured out who Warburg was, the pathos formula. Anyway, long story short, I'm moving now more into art history and commercialization, and basically taking a photographer and sort of following how this photographer takes his work all the way through. He dies in 1990, and then I keep following it through until today. But yes, this is effectively a social history of photographers.
And David, just waiting for more questions to come up. You mentioned the kind of social realism, and so I'm wondering if you can speak more to the aesthetics photography movement, so to speak, and his peers. I wonder, Polish photographers, German or Polish, more Eastern European photographers. I mean, I've looked at more the Magnum photographers and David Seymour and others, but how do you position his influence in that movement, so to speak, given that I'm looking at his photos and he's very much landscape photographer, curating landscapes and scenes and the kind of desolation. So how do you see his kind of lasting influence, I guess, in that realm as a photographer as such?
So I just tell this brief story about how Robert Capa came to the USSR in 1947, believe it or not. He came there with John Steinbeck to actually photograph the USSR back for the Americans. And so he came to the USSR in 1947, and then he went to Israel in 1948. And I actually see his Israeli photographs looking a lot like the Soviet photographs, with these wide landscapes, happy people, and basically generally like uplift of the poor as sort of a folk. So I actually see these people really sort of on the front edge of photography, and actually even back in the 30s, these photographers were widely known in the Western world through this journal called USSR in Construction. I think it was founded in 1920. 1936 and it closed down in 1938. But it was circulated in 4 languages, English, French, German, and Russian. And it circulated all over the world, basically sort of highlighting how Soviet modernism was going to blend into socialist realism. And so I actually feel like these are really important photographers.
Okay, thank you. Are there any more questions from people? Here we go. So how much do you discuss with the students the publication of some photos in Soviet Yiddish language publications, such as the photo of the couple in Budapest, and not in more widely circulated journals? How much should we reference a particular Soviet narrative of commemoration and its construction?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. And I actually had a colleague basically say, it doesn't matter if there's one person reading this or 1 million people reading this. This is the effect of the photographs. So this Yiddish language newspaper was only circulated for 100,000 people, but that's still 100,000 people, that's not an insignificant number of people who are looking at these photographs through a Jewish lens. So I never found, that's point 1. Point 2, I never found the same photograph in a Russian language newspaper that I found in a Yiddish language newspaper. And this is in the Soviet Union. So I found concentration camps, Majdanek, Auschwitz, in the Russian language paper, not a single one in the Yiddish language paper. I think, I have to do this in my head, I think therefore it's because they wanted to see the concentration camps as all Union, as all Soviet, as sort of the humanities expression of fascist atrocities. Whereas the scenes of like the ghetto, the cemetery, were sort of these Jewish sites of atrocity. So they're not different, but one is Jewish and one is sort of overall humanity. So the way I put that, as you're putting here, Matt, is I basically talk about the larger scale conversation and then the smaller scale Jewish conversation. But I don't presume that any one is more important than the other.
Thank you, David. Are there any more questions? Or Christine, do you have any comments or questions to ask?
We just had another comment that came in from Jamie, who just said that you can see this in the early memorials of the camps in Poland as a rejoinder to what you just said. No, I don't actually, and I hope that this session, I found it incredibly useful, and it's quite eye-opening to think the ways that you can think about photography as a teaching tool. So I hope everyone who's participated has found something useful in this. We will, as I said, we will be publishing this back on our YouTube channel. Feel free to save the chat because there's a lot of useful commentary in the chat, and you can just do that by clicking on, there's a little ellipsis. I think I saw one person has already saved it. So if you do that, then you can go ahead and save it and keep it for your files. But yes, Simone, did you have any other closing remarks that you'd like to make before I officially thank everyone?
Yeah, just to thank everyone for participating and joining, and of course to thank David, because I think it's, everyone's really anticipating reading your book, and you're going to have 18 critical reviewers, positive reviewers,
Exactly.
who will be so informed and have such a background. But I think what you've really done is, for me, kind of do a kind of archaeology, like a GIS layering of the photograph.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.